wanted to communicate to you, a lot of people don't realize that earthquake vulnerabilities are well documented. And, just California alone has had scores of earthquakes in the last 100 years where homes have gone through similar ground accelerations that we would go through in a Cascadia subduction zone, even stronger if the ones that were really close to fault ruptures. So, the idea that we can't really know what's going to happen, or even kind of this idea that everything's just going to be destroyed, isn't really true. This is going to be a very big earthquake. There's no doubt about that. It's going to be a big disaster when it happens. But there's just good data out there that you can, and there's assessment methodologies that I use and other engineers will use. We can assess pretty well how a building will do in an earthquake. So that being said, I did want to say too, this is a long duration earthquake, so it's a little bit different, and some conservatism is appropriate, I think, when designing a seismic retrofit. But that doesn't negate the data that we already have and the known vulnerabilities with houses. So I did want to also say too that houses without vulnerabilities, newer wood-framed homes in particular, do well in earthquakes. So and also the mid-90s in particular, that's when the Cascadia subduction zone, at least in Oregon, worked its way into the building code and was adopted and actually enforced. So if your house is newer than that, you're probably okay. Not for sure, but very likely okay. And then generally the older you get, the more likely these vulnerabilities are to happen. Now, the 10 vulnerabilities here that I have listed, it seems like a lot, but I'm kind of listing a lot of unique situations and even some less serious ones, some minor, like for example, your typical old house in Portland has the lack of foundation anchorage and possibly a weak cripple wall also, and then maybe a brick chimney. But there are some houses that you can add number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7. So some houses get a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of complexities, and are more hazardous. So yeah, I want to talk about number 1 and number 2 kind of at the same time a little bit. So lack of foundation anchors is the most well-known earthquake vulnerability. Probably most common. Every moderate earthquake will knock some houses off their foundations that aren't anchored. So, and then I wanted to say too, I guess an important principle is that with earthquakes in houses, damage tends to occur near the foundation level, and that's where all the weight of the house is, and that's where the house is going to feel kind of the seismic shaking the most, and so damage tends to focus there. With old houses, with all houses, there's a discontinuity where the wood frame structure sits on the concrete foundation, and older houses, particularly like if you're pre-1950s, it's almost guaranteed that a house is not anchored or very, very minimally anchored. And then it generally increases. It's kind of hit and miss up until maybe the 70s and 80s, and once you get into the 90s and newer, every house is anchored. But I want to talk about a cripple wall too. What is that? Well, kind of drew this little picture right here. Basic house, cripple walls are this area between the first floor and the top of the foundation. That's the wood framed part of a house between the first floor and the top of the foundation. Not all houses have a cripple wall. If you have a crawl space, an elevated porch where you walk up your porch and you go in your house and you have a crawl space, you typically have a wood framed cripple wall filling the gap of your crawl space around the exterior. Those are very vulnerable for the same reason I talked about earthquake damage occurring near the base of the house. And there's no redundancy. Once you get above the first floor, there are usually numerous interior walls. Once you get below that first floor, all you have is the cripple walls, and you actually only have the exterior sheathing on the cripple walls because there's no interior sheathing. So that's a lot of seismic demand on not a lot of sheathing. And in these older houses, that sheathing type is very weak. So for both of these vulnerabilities, and if a house has a weak cripple wall, it typically has no weak foundation anchorage or none. The house can shift off the foundation with a weak cripple wall, can actually smash the cripple wall, slide a few feet, drop a few feet. There is some potential danger there, but it's definitely an economic concern because it's typically a complete loss of the house economically. Typically, houses have to be completely rebuilt once this happens, and just things get messed up so much when a house gets this kind of damage. It's inexpensive insurance to do mitigation for both of those, and it doesn't necessarily require engineering. There's some textbook ways to do it. You could theoretically at least do it yourself. I don't recommend it particularly for cripple walls because the load path is very important. You really have to complete the entire seismic load path between the first floor sheathing and the top of the foundation, and especially when you have a cripple wall, there are numerous little points that you have to think about. Excuse me. And if someone doesn't know what they're doing, they can miss one of those connection points. It's sort of like a chain. If you have a single weak link, the chain's useless. So if you strengthen some of it, but you don't complete the entire load path, you could have a weak point that there could be slippage right there. So I strongly recommend if you want those addressed in your house to get a seismic retrofit contractor involved, or someone like me if you feel like engineering would be helpful for peace of mind. And if it's a more complicated house, engineering is probably recommended anyway. So that's weak cripple walls and foundation anchorage. So want to get into the Hillside Homes. So going back to my comment before about how seismic damage tends to happen down near the foundation level. Well, you think of your typical hillside home, you have it with a very steep slope. Sometimes you have a really, really big crawl space or open space below the house. So you kind of have that issue, but like on steroids. So you have sometimes a very tall cripple wall. Obviously, the houses on stilts are very vulnerable with weak bracing. Sometimes like a 2x6 with a corroded bolt is not going to last very long in a big earthquake. So these are actually the most dangerous type of homes in earthquakes. Very serious, very important to get your house, if you own or live in a hillside house, to get it assessed by a structural engineer or maybe a geotechnical engineer. And that's the other thing I wanted to say too, is that hillside homes also have landslide risk, potentially. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong. It's important. Not every hillside home is at risk, but generally as a whole, these are more dangerous homes than your typical house. Let's talk about number 4, deteriorated foundations. So in past earthquakes, this hasn't been a big issue. I'm listing it because particularly in Portland, I've noticed as I've been doing this kind of work, there's a lot of bad concrete that was poured. I've heard different kind of theories about why, but like kind of pre-1930s, a significant amount of concrete that was batched and poured then is not doing so well. It's crumbling apart. Sometimes there's a big, large horizontal crack in basements in 100-year-old houses. And, like I said, this isn't necessarily associated with much damage in earthquakes, but it's certainly possible. I mean, if you have crumbling concrete, and obviously if you do a retrofit that attaches to concrete that's crumbling apart or is damaged, you can imagine that attachment's not going to do much good. And also, there is a potential for a basement wall failure during a big earthquake. So, the earthquake could sort of be the last straw. So if you have a deteriorating foundation, obviously that's an issue whether you have an earthquake or not. But an earthquake could be the thing that pushes it over the edge, and you don't want that to happen. So geologic hazards, number 5. There's a lot that could be said about this, and I won't be able to do it all in this video. But I'm going to speak mainly to landslide and liquefaction. I'm actually going to cover liquefaction because I kind of talked about landslide already. There are, for landslide, first of all, the landslide could happen at the site that you're on, or it could happen uphill from you and come down. So, that's all I wanted to say about landslide. Liquefaction. So, some people have heard this word. It's kind of a scary word, soil liquefaction. Happens in saturated, typically sandy soils, but it can happen in similar soils. It can happen in fill when a really kind of well-known issue in Portland is the Northwest Portland Industrial Hub. That whole area used to be a lake, and it was filled in, and it was just poor soil to build structures on. But it tends to happen down near low-lying areas, near rivers, and like I said, it has to be saturated, so liquefaction is going to be a bigger issue if this big earthquake happens in the winter. But it can be an issue in saturated soil no matter what time of year. There are some extreme examples from earthquakes of liquefaction, of things just doing crazy things, sinking into the ground. But in general, it often practically just means that you might get more damage if your house is on an area that is prone to soil liquefaction. You could get some amplified shaking, and you could get some differential settlement, which means part of the house could be sinking a little bit while the ground's shaking, so you could get just additional stresses. So I kind of think of liquefaction as a flag to kind of know that you're probably going to get more damage in this house than typical houses. It strengthens the case for a retrofit, because if you have another vulnerability like a soft story, which we'll talk about next, or something like that, or any of these first ones, liquefaction can just cause more damage, and it can potentially cause catastrophic damage. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm going to have to circle back to that later in a different video. So soft stories. I want to try to cover this as quickly as I can. I'm not going to give you the technical definition of a soft story, but I was mentioning before that damage tends to happen down at the near the foundation level. Sometimes in houses, particularly multi-story houses, damage can occur above the first floor level. And it typically happens because, well, for a wood frame structure, like a house, the house lacks wall segments to bring the seismic forces down. So maybe in one direction, if the earthquake's shaking in that direction, or maybe on one side of the house. A really good example of this is a garage with a living space above, with very little wall segments each side of the garage door. Now, newer houses, you see this condition everywhere, right? Newer houses have that soft story condition built into the design. They've done something typically at each side of the garage door. Sometimes you can do it in different ways. But they should have addressed that. Like I said, if your house is like pre-1995. Houses that have almost no space by the garage door, by each side of the garage door, that can be a very big hazard. You actually have a potential catastrophic situation where the garage can collapse or the upper level can collapse on the garage. And there are other ways a soft story can happen or can occur. But it's important, if you think you have this, it's important to address it, because it is potentially catastrophic. It's like a life safety thing more than some of these other vulnerabilities. Okay, I'll talk about split levels, additions, miscellaneous complexities. I wanted to put this in here mainly to communicate that this isn't necessarily a catastrophic type thing, but simply to communicate that the more discontinuities you have in a house or any building, the more damage is likely to occur. Split levels are kind of famous for that, because you have like the two-story section, and then you have the offset first floor or single floor section, and there's that discontinuity there, and the house often wants to separate a little bit. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to die or the house is going to fall down, but just that there are additions are the same way. Sometimes older house, even with a newer addition, there can be kind of a discontinuity there, and it just wasn't addressed very well when they did the addition. Super complex roof lines, just more damage can occur. You might get a roof leak, that kind of thing. A split level that has a soft story, like where it has the garage, that's important to address, because there have been split level houses where that two-story section has separated from the house and collapsed. So that's important to know. Item number 8, just want to cover good old unreinforced brick. If you live in Portland, you've probably heard of URM buildings. So brick chimneys are notoriously bad in earthquakes. They fall over in moderate earthquakes even. They often break at the roof line. If the chimney's on the exterior, they can fall away from the house. If the chimney sticks considerably far above the roof line, it just keeps getting more and more hazardous the further it sticks up. So the smaller and smaller earthquake it'll take to knock it over. So and then if you're a brick house, that's a dangerous house, generally speaking. Some are more dangerous than others, but would be important to get that assessed. And I have looked at a few. There are a decent amount of brick houses around. And then brittle materials. I wanted to mention stone veneer, brick veneer on a house. Some houses are just covered with them. It's not a structural issue. They're just often these things will crack. The house is wanting to kind of flex and move while the brick's trying to be rigid, and you have a discontinuity there. Often that brick or stone will fall off the house, and it's good to know that is a hazard, at least a falling hazard. It's going to be a pain in the butt to clear up after an earthquake. Number 9, elevated decks, canopies, and stairs. A lot of people just choose to live with this risk, but these type of kind of add-ons to a house can peel away from a house during an earthquake. Sometimes they are kind of integral with a house. That I come across that every once in a while, where a really complicated deck on a house, and maybe you have a second floor that's actually hanging out over the deck, and so you actually have to think about how that interacts with the deck. So yeah, I just wanted to communicate that. And then the contents of your home, and I want to throw in the hot water heater. That's been a source of both flooding and even fire, where as the hot water heater falls over, the gas line and breaks. And then your natural gas valve, you could consider getting an automatic shut-off valve. That's, I think, a good idea. And or just having, just being aware that needs to be turned off right after an earthquake. And then all the heavy objects in, a house that's cluttered with heavy objects can be really hazardous in an earthquake. Actually, this could be one of the more dangerous vulnerabilities, I guess. If you have lots of bookshelves that aren't anchored to the wall, you got a big heavy painting above your bed while you're sleeping, or things like that. You got to. I hear people talking about how you should do a home hazard hunt, and I definitely would recommend doing that. So those are my 10. My name's BJ Kier. My company is Cascadia Risk Solutions. The website is cascadiarisk.com. I'll be making videos about all 10 of these. This video took a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but I hope it's helpful. Let me know. Leave a comment or a question. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions, and I'm obviously happy to come look at your home or building if you need me to. And also, like I said, I currently do have some blog posts about a few of these, at least, topics. So anyway, I hope that's helpful, and I will talk to you soon.